very much, Yuval. It's a great honor and pleasure having you here, or well, having
Thank
you
you.
in the digital sphere and being able to talk to you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you and see you. I hope that you can also hear and see me. There
Yeah.
are always these technical issues
Yeah.
in this era.
Yeah.
Technology is not perfect, but that's what we have.
I think we have a short time lag between here and Israel. Well, not in terms of real time, but in terms of digital time, so to speak. I think,
Yeah.
but we'll cope. Yuval, first, I'd like to start with an obvious but all the same necessary question. I think. You're a historian dealing with universal history. You've written several books that became bestsellers throughout the world, and now you turned one of them, or rather, I'd say, one third or one fourth of them, in any case, only a couple of chapters into a graphic novel. Why did you do that?
Well, the idea actually didn't come from me. It came from David and Daniel, the artists who cooperated with me on this book, and they suggested it. And I really like the idea because I think it's extremely important to bring science to a very wide audience, including to people who don't normally read typical science books. If you don't make the effort to bring science to everybody, then you leave the space open for all kinds of ridiculous conspiracy theories and fake news and things like that. And there are millions of people who don't read the usual scientific literature or even popular science books. So you need to find new ways to communicate. And that's what we try to do with this graphic novel. It's not just moving from text to image. It's also experimenting with different ways of telling history, of explaining science, different genres. So, like one chapter is like a detective movie. We created this fictional detective, Detective Lopez. She goes around the planet to investigate the disappearance of the large animals of planet Earth and who are the serial killers behind it. And then we have another chapter, which is like a superhero action movie. And another part is like a reality TV show. For me, it was, I think, the most fun project I ever worked on. And it taught me so much about the different ways that you can tell history and that you can write science.
Well, I have to say, at first I was rather skeptic. I read your book and I really liked it, and I thought, all right, this is this will not work too well. It's just I just simply couldn't imagine it. But I have to say that it's in my view, it's a fantastic piece. It's like you just said, I think what works so well is that you and your co-authors understood the graphic novel as a genre of its own, with its own rules and with its own possibilities. And you're really making use of these possibilities. Like you said, in some parts are written like a crime novel, it's got a very rich texture. It's got a lot of cultural allusions from Picasso to Saint-Péé and to Magritte and all kinds of popular culture, and it's also got humor, and it's which I particularly liked. So when you're saying it was really fun working on it, I can immediately believe that. Well, can you just describe it a bit further? Because like you said, you have got two co-authors. So there's one artist doing the drawings, I believe.
Yes.
And then there was David, who was responsible for the text. So
yes.
So how did this, or at least part of it, turn into I'll show it to the to those. How did you manage to turn it into that? Well, sort of text-wise, how did you collaborate?
So basically, David would write the basic text, thinking about how to translate the original material from Sapiens into a narrative of a graphic novel. So he is the one that came up with the ideas, oh, let's do this chapter like a detective movie. Let's do this bit like reality TV show. Those are all his ideas. And then he would send it to me, and we would have a back and forth about the text. It's still just words, no images yet. It's just how to tell the story in a different way. And when we agree on that, then you have to draw the images. Now, I draw like a 5-year-old kid, so they can't rely on me for anything there. But there is still a lot of back and forth because Daniel would draw something and send it to me. And sometimes I would consult with archaeologists and anthropologists about the drawing. And then we would come back and say, no, you should change it like this. And he would get sometimes very upset because he worked so hard on, I don't know, this scene with the Neanderthals and the Sapiens, and now we come and say, yes, but it's not accurate. You need, so there was also always kind of a back and forth. And also what I realized is that when you draw, you have to answer many, many questions that you can just ignore when you write a text. Like again, we talk about the encounter of Sapiens and Neanderthals. And we imagine this couple, mixed couple. We know from science that Sapiens and Neanderthals not only had sex, they actually had children together, sometimes like 40, 50, 60,000 years ago. Now, when you write it in a text, you just write, okay, there were mixed couples. When you draw, you have to decide, is it a woman Sapiens and a male Neanderthal or vice versa? And what's their hair color? What's their skin color? And you have to go back to the scientific literature and read about these things. And there are also, of course, racial issues and gender issues that you have to take into account. So I was really kind of surprised by how much new, fresh research I had to do and how many experts I needed to communicate with in order to make all these decisions about how to draw the images.
You're mentioning all the different, all these different aspects, and I can really relate to that. And while what I also like very much that sometimes in a very offhand way you would make a little political statement, like for example the superhero was in fact a superwoman, a black superwoman with a doctor, right? And I like that very much. Where that these kind of things. Well, but so are you saying that you always had the last word in terms of text? So when it clashed,
No.
or
No, there was
an example of a where the artist prevailed and said, "Well, listen, Yuval, well, I understand you very well, but I'm afraid, well, we can't do that."
Well, one very important thing they managed to convince me kind of against my will is to get me inside the story. I mean, they kind of insisted that they want me as a character in the graphic novel that kind of goes around and explains things. And at first I said absolutely no way, because I prefer to keep myself outside my books, at least as the character. But they said, no, it's very important. It's a graphic novel. It's not a typical science book. It's a different thing. And eventually we reached a kind of compromise that, okay, you'll have me in the book on condition that we create an entire set of a group of scientists. It's not just me explaining everything. And it's partly because most of what I know, it didn't come from my own research. So, you know, in the original book, I write things, and I don't always start every sentence, I say that, I think that. So I don't appear a lot. But in the graphic novel, I'm there all the time. So it's important to convey the impression that most of what I know didn't come from me, but from other scientists. I'm not an archaeologist. I never conducted an archaeological excavation. I'm not a geneticist. I don't know how to analyze DNA. So we have these other scientists. Some of them are real people, like Professor Rabin Dunbar from Oxford. Some of them are imaginary characters, like Professor Saraswati, who is our biologist and geneticist. And she explains and she explains a lot of things instead of me explaining everything.
Yeah. Well, that forms a kind of backbone of the whole thing. But here's the thing. Well, I think that while you're saying that, well, you're talking about yourself, well, as a persona being so to speak inserted into the book. I think over the course of time, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but well, I think in Sapiens, in the book, you do not appear at all. Well, sort of, it's not well
at all. Yeah.
First person singular, but at least in well, 21 lessons for the 21st century, there you already appear. Well, sort of there you where we, as a reader, well, I can experience some contours of yours, and it's actually very nice there. You're saying, all right, but sort of I didn't know anything about this or that, and then well, a bit later on, well, sort of about some tribe in Tanzania, for example, well, sort of I found something out. So there you appear in the text, and now you're actually you're real. Well, sort of well. I may even show it to our viewers. Well, this is Yuval's persona, and he's very present in the graphic novel. So yeah, it's weird for you, isn't it? Well, sort of, it's a bit weird to see yourself suddenly coming to life in a book. Well,
yeah, it's a bit weird. I got used to it.
Well, especially as a historian, well, sort of. Well, you need to keep a certain, well, I don't know, sort of academic aloofness. Well, I wouldn't say impartiality, but aloofness. Well, I'm afraid, well, this has now gone to pieces. Well, with a graphic novel, I think that's the price you have to pay for going graphic.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a very different genre with very different rules. Now, I still think that it's history. It's a science book. We still do our best, to represent the latest scientific discoveries and fact check everything. And of course, it's all presented in a package which is very different, with fictional characters and a fictional plot. But in a way, that's what historians always do. I mean, every history book is always based on a large amount of imagination, because humans think in stories, but reality doesn't come packaged as a story. So even every decision, like you write a history book, where you start and where you end, which scene is the opening scene and which scene is the last scene in your book, this is actually a piece of storytelling, because reality never comes in this shape. There are no opening scenes and end scenes in history. It just goes on and on and on. There is no focus in history. In a movie or even in a book, there is always focus. Like you have a frame, somebody is in the focus, somebody is on the side, and many people don't appear at all. But in reality, there is no camera in the air hanging over planet Earth, focusing. This is the camera of history. And now it's focused on Angela Merkel or on Donald Trump or whatever. No, reality is everything. But as a historian, you do have to choose. This is in the focus, this is outside the frame. So in this sense, I don't think that the graphic novel is, like a complete breakage with historical traditions.
No, sure.
It's just a different way of telling the story.
Sure. And well, you do explain, well, in the graphic novel as well as in the book, in the non-fiction book, that there are vast, well, so to speak, blank spots or blind spots in our knowledge about these prehistoric times. And why sort of I think that's very good that you're, so to speak, laying bare your own your own inability to explain everything, or at least by sort of that in the end it's all a conjecture, or not all, but that a lot of it is conjecture.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many central questions that we don't have an answer to. We don't know what was the family structure in the Stone Age. There are so many arguments about family structure and gender relations. Were people monogamous? Did men dominate women? Or was it a more egalitarian society? Did they even have nuclear families? Or did they have a different family structure? We don't really know. So in the graphic novel, this is presented through a conference in which different scientists and also people from the audience present different views. And the message is, we don't have the definitive answer about that. And similarly, when we discuss war, a lot of people think that war is part of human nature. And that humans were always violent. It's part of our nature. But amazingly, when you look at the archaeological evidence, the earliest evidence, conclusive evidence for large-scale violence is just from 12,000 years ago. There is a famous, among archaeologists famous cemetery from 12,000 years ago in a place called Jabal Sahaba, today in Sudan, where you have a large number of people with signs of violence on them. And that's the first evidence for large-scale violence. Now we have evidence for individual murders from before that, here and there, but no evidence for big battles or wars or whatever. Now it's inconclusive either way, because what kind of evidence will remain from a war that took place 40,000 years ago? Not much. But it's still amazing to realize that all these discussions and theories about the violent nature of humanity and the eternity of war, you don't have anything conclusive from before 12,000 years ago, which is just on the eve of the agricultural revolution.
Well, by the way, by sort of talking about violence, this is one thing I think where you have some so to speak generic limitations. I think your book, even if you don't put it into ultra drastic words, it still conveys quite a precise image of a rather violent history over time. And while this violence is very difficult to depict in a graphic novel, if you don't want to be right in the face of the reader, I think there's a so to speak, I'd call it a generic limitation, which is fair enough. I think they are just different genres.
Certainly. In images, again, it makes it far more stark than when it's just in words. But of course, even if we don't have direct evidence for warfare, we didn't know that there was a lot of other kinds of violence. We do know, for example, we have a lot of evidence that as Homo sapiens spread from East Africa, this led to the extinction of all the other human species that lived on Earth at that time, like the Neanderthals, and also many, many species of animals. We don't know exactly what was the mechanism, whether there were actually battles between sapiens and Neanderthals. Was it more like a competition in which sapiens hunted and gathered all the food, so the Neanderthals gradually starved and dwindled and disappeared? We are not sure. But there is quite a lot of evidence that our species has been the most lethal animal in the history of the planet, even before agriculture. Even long before the modern age, with all the industry and all that, we were already the kind of biggest killers in the history of life on Earth.
Well, this is I think very interesting, because on the one hand you're de-romanticizing, so to speak, the prehistoric age, and at the same time you're saying, hey, actually, life was relatively easy then in comparison to what followed, namely the agricultural revolution, where people were kind of bluffed into a way of living that was far harsher for them. Can you just expand a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, for the average person, the agricultural revolution was probably the biggest mistake in human history. If you look at it from the perspective of a king or a queen in ancient Egypt, then of course life is good. If you look at it from our perspective today, as say middle-class people in prosperous society, then yes, it's a wonderful thing that there was the agricultural revolution, that we are not now hunter-gatherers living in some cave or some wood. But if you look at it from the perspective of the average farmer in ancient societies, say a peasant in ancient China or in ancient Egypt, life was much worse after the agricultural revolution. You worked much harder, more difficult jobs. You know, our bodies and minds have been adapted to climbing trees, to pick apples and running after gazelles and things like that, not to dig in ditches and harvesting and grinding wheat and rice all day. And in exchange for all the hard work, you actually got a worse diet. Hunter-gatherers ate dozens of different kinds of animals and mushrooms and fish and fruits and vegetables, so they have a very balanced diet. As an ancient peasant, in Egypt you mostly eat wheat and barley. In China you mostly eat millet or rice. It's a very unbalanced diet. You suffer far more from epidemics. You know, it's now all over the news, epidemics. But it's important to realize that epidemics actually started only with the agricultural revolution. Hunter-gatherers didn't have epidemics because first they didn't have any domesticated animals like chickens and pigs, and most infectious diseases of humans, they came to us from the chickens and pigs and cows that we raise. Even if a disease comes from a wild animal, like with coronavirus, which came originally from a bat, a wild bat, as a hunter-gatherer, if you catch a virus from some bat, so you know, you live in a very small band of say 20 people, 50 people, who moves around all the time and hardly ever meet anybody else. So maybe you get sick, maybe say 5 people in your band die, and that's it. The disease is over because there is nobody else to infect. Yeah. Once you start having agriculture, people live in towns and cities connected with trade networks. This is like the perfect place for germs and pathogens. So if a virus jumps from a chicken or a bat to a villager, then you have an epidemic. Yeah. Then millions of people can die from that. So this starts with agriculture. Agriculture didn't solve the problem of disease. It created the problem of disease. And finally, on top of all that, you have all the political problems that agriculture leads to hierarchy, to far more violence and exploitation and slavery. You know, there were no slaves before the agricultural revolution. People didn't own anything. They didn't even own animals. You know, the idea that a human being can own another being was simply ridiculous. You know, lions don't own zebras and crocodiles don't own ducks. So why should humans own cows or chickens or whatever? But once they start owning other animals, they get the idea, hey, if I can own a goat, why can't I own a human? And you start seeing the rise of slavery. And also, according at least to some theories, this is the moment when the relations between the genders change, and at least some men get the idea that they can own women and the reproductive capacities of women in the same way that they own goats and cows and their reproductive capacity.
Well, I very much like your way of, so to speak, in passing, debunking a lot of misbeliefs or misconceptions of ours about, well, various ages in life. And while you're going as far as saying, well, sort of, well, you believe that we are now more intelligent than those primitives back then. Well, forget about it. Well, individually, they were actually, well, there's indication that they might have been even cleverer than we are now. And we are collectively more intelligent, so to speak, while we are able to organize knowledge in a collective way.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, as a collective, we are far more powerful and intelligent. We can create spaceships and computers and whatnot, and they could just, build or create stone tools and things like that. But as individuals, we actually know far less. I don't even have the knowledge of what I need to do to survive, to sustain myself. I mean, all the food that I eat, I don't grow it or hunt it or gather it. I have no idea how to grow food or get food. I just go to the I sell books, I get money, I go to the supermarket, I buy whatever I need. Now, if there are no supermarkets and I actually need to grow my food myself or hunt or gather, I would be dead in a week. I don't know how to do it. Yeah. And even the tools of my own trade, like a book. So I don't know how to make paper or how to make ink or how to print books. And that's not just me, it's almost everybody. Most people today, they know a lot about a very, very narrow field, which is their profession. And they hardly know much about everything else. And it's not just the food, it's the geography, it's the climate, it's knowing your immediate environment. People sometimes live in a neighborhood and they never even visited the neighboring house. And hunter-gatherers, they knew so much about animals, about plants, about the climate, about the geography, about how to make tools, because to survive, you relied on your own skills. If you didn't have good skills, you couldn't do it.
Yeah. I was actually reminded of a performance by a contemporary artist who took a strongbow and started hunting and gathering in a supermarket. And it was quite well. So for me, it encapsulated precisely that what you're talking about. Can you just quickly? Well, there's so much to talk about, and I'm afraid that we won't have time for all. But still, what I really liked was also was the end, was the court case when Sapiens was actually put to court for being an ecological serial killer, and it was very moving. And I thought you and the co-authors, you really managed to do that very well to actually divide the different positions by putting some opinions in the mouth of the lawyer, defending the Sapiens, and then having the state attorney. That was beautiful. And in the end, even Yuval, the persona, being told off by his niece that he is responsible too. I thought that was a very, even very touching end. I thought it was, very, very good. You found a...
Yeah, we had a lot of, you can imagine, we had a lot of discussions and back and forth about how to end it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, and the entire chapter, it deals with a very difficult and tragic subject matter of how humans, not just now, but for thousands, tens of thousands of years, have been causing the disappearance of species, the destruction of habitats, the undermining of the ecological system. And people hear about it so much, and how to present it in a fresh way, and in a way that will not kind of put people off. Oh, I don't want to read another time about all these things. So the kind of doing it like a whodunit mystery, with a detective trying to find the serial killer. This was the kind of brilliant move by Daniel and David.
Yeah, I think it works extremely well. Well, congratulations on it. It really was there. You found a really, really good end to it. Well, can I just briefly come back to one or two contentions of yours, which I like, because you really try to almost to turn them into kind of provocative axioms, like sort of
please.
Like, in the beginning, I think it's the professor you're visiting together with your niece, who's saying that, well, you cannot understand the French Revolution without understanding the evolution of man or mankind.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, humans are animals. Many of us don't like to admit it, but we are animals, we are apes. Of course, we are special animals. We have abilities that other animals don't have, like cooperating in very large numbers and creating all these religions and corporations and money, but we are still animals. So we are subject to the laws of biology, and you can't understand humans and their history if you ignore the biological basis of everything we do. And the current pandemic is a very good reminder of that, that you can't understand history if you separate it from biology and from the ecological system, because they continually interact. Of course, history is still not the same as biology, because there are, in addition to the biological forces, they are also unique historical forces that don't exist in a chimpanzee band or in an elephant group, but do exist in a human society. And these are all these creations of humans, like religions and like ideologies and like our economic theories. You can't understand history if you ignore these either.
Mm-hmm. Well, is that what I remember in the book? I think you didn't include it in the graphic novel, but in the book there comes a passage. Well, I think shortly after the chapter on cognitive revolution, when you're saying something like, well, it all could have turned out in a completely different way too. And I remember thinking to myself, all right, maybe Yuval had the impression that the text turned out too deterministic and wanted to correct this impression. Well, so how deterministic is your view in the end, or isn't?
No, I'm not. I mean, I think that history is very undeterministic. Many of the big events in history were extremely surprising. You know, if you live in the Roman Empire in the 3rd century and somebody tells you that in a couple of decades the Christians will take over the empire and it will be the state religion, you would think this man is completely out of his mind. You know, this esoteric little Jewish sect from some province in the east, they are going to take over the empire? That's ridiculous. And I think it wasn't deterministic. There is nothing in the geography, in the climate, or whatever of the Mediterranean which forced history to move in that direction. There are many other religions contending for supremacy in the Mediterranean at the same time. Yeah. You have Mithraism and Manichaeanism and the ancient pagan religions and even Hinduism and Buddhism sending emissaries to the Mediterranean. If you rewind, if history is a movie, and you rewind it and press play and do it 100 times, again and again, to see what happens, I think maybe just 2-3 times Christianity takes over. In 97% of the cases, it remains a footnote in history that maybe some professor knows about. Yeah, there was this tiny Jewish sect for like 2 centuries, but it didn't do anything much. And it's the same if you look at modern history. You think about the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. You know, you had almost 200 million people in Russia at the time. The nobility and the rich people alone, they numbered something like 3 million people. The numbers of members in Lenin's Bolshevik sect was something like 20,000, 30,000. It was a tiny, tiny group in a huge empire, and a set of very extraordinary circumstances enabled them to grab power, and then they, of course, wouldn't let power go. Even the Marxist thinkers, like Marx himself, they said in Russia, you'll never have a communist revolution in Russia, no way. Yeah. And it's one of the most important events of modern history. And again, I think if you play the movie of history 100 times, maybe just once or twice, Lenin and his friends take power. In all the rest of the scenarios, they are just a tiny footnote in history. And even if you come back, if you come to today, you think about the election of Donald Trump. If, I don't know, 30,000 people in Pennsylvania changed their minds, everybody would look back and would say he had never had any chance. The Republicans were crazy to put him as a candidate. And if you think about COVID, again, if some bat has decided to fly in this direction tonight and not in that direction, nobody today would be talking about any COVID or any pandemic.
Can I ask you a personal question? It's fascinating to listen to you developing these ideas, and well, sort of how does a historian of universal history cope with or deal with daily life? What do you constantly look at everyday appearances as well? Do you constantly translate it into sort of bigger theories, or or are these lives completely distinct? How do you switch perspective?
Sometimes, I have my kind of daily issues like anybody else, but it does give you perspective. Like again, in this current crisis, the first thing I did when the crisis erupted, when COVID-19 really started spreading, and as a historian, I had the thought, well, maybe this is the big one that people have been talking about for a long time. Because for a long time, there were these expectations, sooner or later, there will be another pandemic. This is part of human history. Every couple of decades, you have a big pandemic, and people for years were waiting for the next big one. And so the first thing I did, I took a book about the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, to get a perspective on what's happening. And it was actually a very comforting experience to read that book, because I had this kind of double vision that I would listen to the news, what's happening right now, and I would read the book about 1918, 1919. And always, 1918 was worse. No matter what were the news of the day, what I was reading about the pandemic of 1918 was much, much worse in every respect, in terms of the number of people who die, but above all, in our understanding of the situation.
Yeah.
Throughout the 1918 pandemic, the best scientists weren't sure what was causing the epidemic. The study of viruses was just beginning at the time, and they never managed to really understand the epidemic and how to stop it. It ran its course basically naturally. Many of the measures they took were ineffective. And if you go even further back in time and you read about the Black Death, then this was much, much worse in terms of mortality, and nobody has the slightest idea what was causing the death. Yeah. And here with COVID, it just took like 2-3 weeks to find out, okay, this is a virus, and we know which virus it is. It's from the SARS family. Yeah. And they even sequenced its entire genome in just 2-3 weeks. And very quickly, we found out how it passes from one person to another and how you can stop or limit the infection, which is critical, because different epidemics. Yeah. I still remember the previous big one, which was AIDS. And AIDS was far worse in many respects. If you got AIDS in the 1980s, you died. Yeah. It was like a 98 or 99% mortality at the beginning. Yeah. And so all this gives you perspective on current events, which many times makes you a bit more balanced in your reactions.
And it works the other way too. Like current events give you a new perspective on the past. I heard talk lately, actually, of another Israeli scientist who said, one of the consequences of COVID-19 is that we now start injecting the pandemic into historical events. Well, before, like you said, sort of the Spanish fever from the beginning of the 20th century, sort of hardly anybody knew about it. Even though it was hardly anybody outside the academic scene, so to speak, knew about it. And now, while we start looking at it, or while we look at, say, sort of the Napoleonic military campaign in Russia, and we suddenly discover, hey, there was more to it than just Russia being too vast a land to be conquered, but actually there was again, they had to deal with all sorts of illnesses. So
yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, as a military historian, I know that before the 20th century, most soldiers who died in war didn't die in battle.
Yeah.
For every soldier who died in battle in the Napoleonic Wars or in the Crusades or in the Roman campaigns, something like 10 soldiers died from either infectious diseases or from starvation, or the combination of the two. They usually go together. Yeah. When you starve, you're more, your immune system is weaker. So yes, when you live in a pandemic, suddenly you go back to history and you find it everywhere. And you are right that after some time, people forget. Yeah. It doesn't, one of the strange things about pandemics, and maybe COVID will be different, because it's a different age. We have YouTube and TikTok and everybody's taking selfies, so maybe it will be different. But strangely, previous pandemics left a very shallow cultural mark. Like if you think about the big influenza of 1918, 1919, I don't think that a single famous work of art has been inspired by it or deals with it. You have so many poems and books and paintings and theater plays about the First World War. Yeah. There is nothing about the pandemic, even though the pandemic killed many more people than the war.
Why is that? Why is that? Because it belongs to the realm of the natural or to nature, and thus sort of cannot be contained in the same way than everything human.
I think it's much more difficult for us to write about characters which are not human. It goes back to the question of presenting stories. Yeah. And, as a counterexample, if you think about AIDS was different. There is a lot of art about AIDS, because in that case, also the epidemic was very political. Yeah. Yeah. If you think about something like Angels in America, the story is not the virus itself or the disease. Yeah. The real story is the political battles and the social battles around it. Yeah. So maybe this is what making the difference.
But maybe that's right. Well, maybe there artists took it up because it, so to speak, coincided with a political battle. Yeah, the battle for emancipation of the homosexuals. So that coincided. So it was taken up, and that wasn't the case with the Spanish fever, with the influenza from 1918, where sort of it just hit anybody at random. So yeah, maybe it was that, but it's that's interesting. All right. Well, sort of one more question. Well, I think Yuval, because before we'll have to open the floor. Well, I presume. Yeah. Well, we just carry on, and finally somebody will tell us. But I presume it's going to be pretty soon. There's what I also like very much is your way of looking at modern day bureaucracy. Well, it's been looked upon by, or it's been analyzed by many people. But what you're saying, well, I thought was very, it was a very fresh look. But well, you just said, well, hey, listen, well, sort of you look at what again was sort of the primitive people in the prehistoric ages, and well, with all their arcane rituals, and was sort of well, sort of obviously sort of they didn't have a clue about anything. They ascribed some kind of divine forces to natural phenomena, etc., when sort of and had some weird, derived some weird rituals from it. And you're saying, well, listen, actually, well, if we look at modern day life, it's full of rituals. And well, sort of we just believe, well, we just take them for granted, but in fact, they are as weird as anything on earth. I thought that was wonderful. Well, sort of, can you just expand a bit on that? Because I don't think everybody has read the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's always easy to make fun of the rituals and beliefs of other people, but you think that you're perfectly natural in what you believe. It's always like that. So, for example, if you think about central modern institutions like corporations, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all these big corporations who kind of run the economy of the world, and you think, what are they? And actually, they are just a fictional story created by modern day shamans that we call corporate lawyers. In the same way that in ancient times, people would create gods and goddesses and so forth just by telling a story about them. That's the same with modern corporations. I mean, a corporation is not a physical or biological entity. It's not a river, it's not a chimpanzee, it's not an elephant. You can't see it, you can't touch it.
Yep.
It's not the factories that it's owned, it's not the workers. Even if you ask lawyers, what is a corporation? They will tell you it's a legal fiction. It's a story that we tell, and as long as everybody believes the story, then it works. It can own property, it can employ people, but that's the same with ancient gods. You know, in ancient civilizations, gods owned property, they owned land, they employed people. And it's even the same with money. Probably the greatest story ever invented is the story of money, because really it's the only one that everybody believes. Not everybody believes in God or in the same God, but everybody believes in money, and even in the same money, like in euro or the dollar. Now, even Islamic fundamentalists, they're willing to accept dollars. They hate America, they hate Europe, they hate all these values, but euros, yes, we'll accept them. And if you think, but what are these things? They, again, I mean, a euro bill, you can't eat it, you can't drink it, it has no objective value. But then you have these greatest storytellers in the world, that the economists, the bankers, the finance ministers, they tell us, this colorful piece of paper is worth 10 bananas. And if you believe it, and I believe it, and everybody around us believe it, it works. I can go to the supermarket, I can go to a complete stranger, give them a euro note or a 10 euro note and get bananas that I can eat. And today it's even gone further than that. Today most money in the world, they don't even bother to print the notes. Just something like 5% of the money is actually physical. In the crisis, in COVID, the central banks created trillions of euros and dollars out of nothing. They didn't bother to print them. They just go to the computer and add a zero somewhere, and €1 trillion has been born today. Well, and it's the same like, you know, it's the same like shamans telling people stories about gods. As long as everybody believes, it works.
Well, which brings us to the question of trust, which was something that I wanted to talk about with you too. But before that, I just wanted to point out this thing about corporations. And well, while you give the examples of the car factory, well, sort of Peugeot, well, sort of what is actually Peugeot? Well, sort of does exist, well, even without the cars, does it exist without the management, etc., etc. And I believe that's a very strong example. And I think this works even better in the graphic novel. And you know why? Because in the graphic novel, you can make people from different times meet. So in the graphic novel, you have Yuval Harari meeting Armand Peugeot and explaining to him that, well, in fact, well, your corporation isn't anything. Well, so it's just a fiction, and that was beautiful, and so that well, shows to me, well, sort of not only the strength of the different genres, but also that it's very good to translate that into a graphic novel, because some things work better, other things work worse.
Yeah.
So it's that was beautiful. But can we just briefly, as I said, I think the team of Klaus will intervene pretty soon. Talk one more minute about trust.
Yes.
Well, like you said, and I thought it was very very poignant. Money in the end, it's nothing more than trust. I trust that you and I accept the euro or the dollar or whatever as a currency.
Again, I'm not implying, of course, that it's bad. Without it, all our civilization will collapse. But it's really the best, or I don't know if the best. It's the most effective, most efficient system of mutual trust ever developed. And as you say, money is not made of gold or silver or paper. Money is actually made of trust. Whatever you can find that everybody trusts, it can serve as money. If people trust digital information being passed between computers, if people are willing to work an entire month, and at the end of the month, the only thing that happens is that somebody transfers some data to some computer file, it works. The entire trade network of the world works like that.
But the frightening thing is, is that also political systems in the end are based on trust. While you can have all the institutions of the world, democracies. Let's take the one that is dear to me. As a political system, in the end, it works on trust.
Exactly. And one of the frightening things when you look at, like the US election, which is coming very soon, for me, the most frightening thing is to see the destruction of trust within American society, because, dictatorship can somehow manage without trust. Democracies cannot function without trust between the different parts of society. You can have disagreements, of course. I don't agree with you. But I don't see you as an enemy or a traitor. I don't see you as somebody I need to fight. The moment I start seeing my political rivals as enemies and traitors, you can no longer have a democracy.
Precisely.
It's the road to either civil war or dictatorship. But if you don't have trust, there is no democracy.
I completely agree, and on this,
I also agree with you, but I think that also dictatorship based on trust in a certain way. But the first question, can you give some positive, optimistic outlook for the future of mankind?
Oh, there are many optimistic and positive predictions that I can give. I don't know if they will happen. I'm not a prophet. I don't know. Nobody knows how the world would look like in 20 years or 40 years. It depends on the decisions that we make. So, you take something like artificial intelligence and all the new surveillance technology. You can use it to create, say, the best healthcare system that ever existed. Now, with the epidemic, healthcare is on everybody's minds, so let's focus on that. If you have a system that monitors what's happening inside my body 24 hours a day, I just wear, say, a biometric bracelet that constantly monitors my heartbeat, my blood pressure, my brain activity, my sugar level. That's a technology that we'll soon have. And you connect that to an AI system, a machine learning system. You just created the best and cheapest healthcare system in history that you can give to all the billions of people in the world. You can use it not just to stop epidemics very easily, but you can identify something like cancer when it's just beginning to spread and it's still very easy and cheap to stop it. And of course, there is a downside. The same system, in the wrong hands, can create the worst totalitarian regime in human history. Something far, far worse even than Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. Because you have a system that can monitor people all the time, even under their skin. Maybe Stalin and Hitler wanted to know what people feel every moment of the day, but they couldn't do it. With this technology, it's becoming possible. So what will we use the technology for? To have the best healthcare system in history, which is a wonderful thing, or to have the worst totalitarian regime in history, which is a terrible thing? The technology is neutral. It can do both things. It depends on the decisions we take, whether we will have the positive future or the negative future.
And we are so free to decide, or there is one question, can a sapien actively create change, or is change happening?
We have some agency. About many things we have no control, but we do still have some control as human beings. I think power is shifting away from us. More and more decisions are being taken by algorithms, deciding whether to give us a loan in the bank, whether to hire us for a job, whether even to put us in jail. The power is shifting, but we still have power. We need to use it wisely and quickly before it's too late. We need to understand that all these issues in the end are political issues. You can't leave it to, say, the big corporations to decide what to do with the internet or with surveillance technology or with AI. This should be the main political questions that are presented to the voters. But of course, for that, the voters need to understand the issues that they are facing. You see it with climate change, you see it with the epidemic, you'll see it in the future with AI, that without a good scientific basis, a good scientific understanding, it's meaningless to talk about human freedom, because if you don't understand the choices you're facing, then your freedom is meaningless.
Another question, Peter doesn't understand the title of your book, Homo Deus. What do you mean by this?
Well, homo is human in Latin, and Deus is God. And the idea, very simply, is that humans are in the process of becoming gods. And I don't mean it as a kind of metaphor for something. I mean it literally. If you think about the powers that, at least in mythologies, gods have, these are the powers that we are now acquiring. For the other animals, we are already gods. We completely control the lives and the destinies of the cows, of the chickens, even the lions. If we decide tomorrow morning, let's kill all the lions on the planet, 1 week, they're all gone. Very easy. So for them, we are already gods. But we are increasingly, we are increasingly also gaining the ability, to redesign life. To create, not only with genetic engineering, but also with advanced computer science, we are gaining the ability to create new kinds of life forms. Maybe soon we'll create the first inorganic life forms in the history of the planet. For 4 billion years, all life was organic. Even in the Bible, God creates only organic life forms. All the animals and plants and so forth. Now we are on the verge of creating the first inorganic life forms in the evolution of life. So I would say that these are divine powers. Of course, we are not omnipotent. We are not like the biblical God, who is completely omnipotent. We are more like, I would say, the Greek gods or the Nordic gods, all these Zeus and Thor and Freya and all these guys, that they have their limitations, they have their problems, so we are going to be these kinds of gods.
Yeah, maybe the last question, because we are the end of this discussion. From what age would you advise this book? For children too?
Oh, no, it's not a children's book. I mean, children can read it if they want, but it's an adult book. People think that comics is for kids, but no, it's a very serious book. It deals with difficult issues, from relations between species to the invention of religions and so forth. And it's aimed, I would say, at teenagers and adults. We are also working on a real children's book for kids age around 10, 11, 12. I'm actually working on this with a German team, with people from DTV and from Beck Publishing House. And we hope that next year the children's book will be published. But it will be, again, very different from the adult version and from the graphic novel. It will be